On the night of the Meridian Global Charity Gala, the man with a wrench in his hand was invisible to everyone in the room. Hunter Xavier saw no threat when he dragged Mason Carter to the center of the marble floor and shoved a gun toward his ribs, ordering him to choose who would die first, Eleanor Madison or himself. He saw only a tired single father, small enough to break in front of a crowd. Mason did not tremble. He studied the exits, the fire panel, the cameras, and the breathing of every hostage in the room, saying nothing at all. Rain fell steadily over the city the night Meridian Global opened its doors for the annual Investors Gala, and the tower on the corner of the financial district glowed gold against the wet dark. Limousines lined the curb. Guests in tailored coats crossed the red carpet under umbrellas held by valets, laughing at nothing in particular, already halfway into the practiced charm the evening demanded of them. Cameras from 2 local networks caught the arrivals, board members, hedge fund partners, and the young reporters hoping for a quote about the merger everyone was whispering about. Mason Carter came in through the service entrance around the side of the building, the one without a carpet or an awning, where the rain simply landed on cracked concrete and ran toward a drain nobody had fixed in years. He wore a gray work jacket with the Meridian logo stitched small over the pocket, carried a toolbox in one hand, and moved with the unhurried economy of a man who had learned long ago not to waste steps. Before his shift began, he stepped into the stairwell and called the woman who watched his daughter on nights like this. His voice was even, almost gentle. He told her he might be late, that the gala always ran long, and that there was soup in the refrigerator if anyone got hungry before bed. He did not complain. He never did. Whatever weight he carried it quietly, the way he carried everything. Inside, he worked through his checklist with the same patience. The breaker panel behind the catering hall, the fire suppression sensors above the ballroom, the badge scanners on every service corridor. Executives passed him in the hallway without a glance, the way people look through furniture. A junior manager nearly collided with him and offered no apology. None of it seemed to touch him. Lucas Ryan, the company's polished chief financial officer, paused near the ballroom doors long enough to tell the event manager, in a voice pitched just loud enough for Mason to hear, that the maintenance staff should stay out of sight near the guest of honor's table. Mason said nothing. He simply adjusted a panel cover and moved on, tucking the remark away the way he filed everything else that didn't require an immediate response. Eleanor Madison arrived a few minutes later, moving through the room like a woman who had rehearsed every gesture of the night in her head 12 times already. She was composed, sharp-eyed, dressed in deep navy that made her look older and more certain than her 34 years. The merger papers waited in her office upstairs unsigned, and the weight of that decision sat behind her eyes even as she smiled for the cameras. When Mason found her near the stage to report that 2 of the security doors along the east corridor were responding sluggishly to their sensors, she thanked him briskly and told him to log it with operations. She didn't ask his name. She had no reason to in her world. Men in gray jackets existed to fix problems quietly and disappear, and this night, with $1 billion merger hanging over her head, she had no attention left for anyone who wasn't a lawyer, a banker, or a camera. Mason returned to his rounds, but something in the east corridor kept pulling his attention back. A camera above a side hallway had been angled 2 degrees off its usual position, aimed at the floor instead of the door. A card scanner that should have required dual authorization had somehow been overwritten to accept a single badge. And on the guest list pinned to the security office corkboard, one name, a former contractor, had been crossed out entirely, as though someone had wanted no record that the man had ever worked in this building at all. Mason didn't say a word about it to anyone. He simply checked his watch, filed the discrepancies into the back of his mind where he kept things that mattered, and kept walking, his eyes just a little sharper than they had been an hour before. Somewhere behind him, the string quartet started a new piece, bright and oblivious, and the gala rolled forward exactly as it was meant to, glittering and unaware of the small, quiet alarm now sitting patiently at the edge of one maintenance worker's attention. The ballroom filled with the low hum of expensive conversation, glasses clinking, a string quartet working through something forgettable near the bar. Eleanor stood at the podium and delivered the speech her team had polished for 3 days, promising the investors that Meridian Global stood on stable ground, that the numbers would speak for themselves once the merger closed, that the company's future had never looked brighter. She smiled through every sentence. Behind that smile sat a mounting pressure she hadn't shared with anyone in the room. Lucas Ryan had spent the past 2 weeks pushing a set of emergency financial transfer documents in front of her, insisting they were necessary to shield the company from what he called market volatility. Eleanor hadn't signed. Something about the language felt wrong, clauses buried in dense legal phrasing that seemed to grant far more authority than any ordinary safeguard should require. Her assistant, Amelia Grace, had quietly noticed a pattern of payments routed to a handful of shell companies, nothing conclusive yet, but enough to make her stomach tighten every time she reviewed the ledgers. Meanwhile, Mason kept working his rounds unnoticed, his eyes moving over details nobody else in the building thought to track. Near the catering entrance, he clocked a man dressed as waitstaff whose shoes didn't match the uniform at all, thick-soled, lace-tight, built for movement rather than serving trays. The man's hands never strayed far from beneath his jacket, and his gaze kept measuring the distance between the main doors and the roped-off section reserved for the board. That man was Hunter Xavier. Mason recognized the posture immediately, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his eyes swept the room in fixed intervals instead of drifting the way a nervous person's would. Mason reported it to building security, described exactly what he'd seen, but the guard on duty waved him off. The system showed Hunter as a credentialed guest. Someone with real access had cleared him days ago, which meant whatever was coming had been arranged from the inside. Mason didn't push the argument. Confrontation wasn't the goal. Instead, he memorized what mattered, where Hunter stood, how many exits remained open, which guests looked closest to panic, which sections of the building could be sealed remotely from the security office upstairs. He'd learned long ago that information gathered quietly was worth more than anything won by raising his voice. Hunter drifted closer to the main floor just as Eleanor stepped down from the podium, and for a moment his eyes fixed on her with something that looked less like anger and more like grief curdled into fury. In the brief exchanges that followed between guests near the bar, fragments came together. He had once worked security contracts for Meridian. He had been fired after an incident the company blamed entirely on him, a decision that had cost him his career, his reputation, and from the bitterness in his face, far more than that. Then the lights along the ceiling flickered once, twice, and went dim. The glass doors at the main entrance clicked shut with the particular finality of an automatic lock. Engaging. Phones around the room lost signal almost simultaneously, screens blinking uselessly in 100 pockets and clutches. Hunter climbed onto the low stage where Eleanor had stood minutes earlier, and the room's understanding of the evening shifted entirely. This was no longer a fundraiser. It was something that had been built, piece by piece, long before anyone walked through the door. For a moment, nobody moved at all, the entire ballroom suspended between disbelief and the slow, dawning understanding that whatever came next would not be resolved by security or apologies. Eleanor's grip tightened on the podium's edge, her carefully rehearsed composure cracking for the first time all evening as she watched the man in the waiter's uniform step fully into the light. Hunter forced the crowd to the floor with a few sharp commands, separating the board members and senior executives from everyone else. He moved with a strange mixture of desperation and precision, unstable in his temper but far from careless in his knowledge. He knew which cameras were still recording. He knew which doors had already been sealed. He seemed to know exactly what document Eleanor needed to sign before the night ended, which raised an uncomfortable question hanging silently over the room. Whether this man was truly acting alone. Eleanor tried to reason with him, offering to hear whatever grievance he carried, promising a fair review of his case. Hunter laughed, low and humorless, and told her every word out of her mouth had already been rehearsed by someone else. He blamed Meridian for the collapse of his career, his home, everything he'd built before the company decided he was expendable. Around them, the guests trembled in place, a few investors wept quietly. Lucas performed fear convincingly enough, though his eyes tracked Eleanor far more than they tracked the armed man in front of him. Mason stayed near the technical station along the side wall, close enough to the shadows to avoid notice. But when a young employee broke into a panicked run toward a side exit, Hunter spun toward the movement with his weapon rising. Mason crossed the floor fast and low, catching the young man's arm and pulling him down before Hunter had a reason to escalate. It was a small act, quiet and controlled, but it drew Hunter's full attention for the first time. Hunter demanded to know who he was. A trembling manager blurted that Mason was only the maintenance man, nothing more. Something shifted behind Hunter's eyes, an idea forming quickly. In his mind, Mason represented everything he despised about how this building worked. A man with no title, no protection, no one who would fight for him if things went wrong. Choosing him felt like a statement, forcing the people who looked down on men like Mason to watch his life balanced entirely on Hunter's next decision. Outside the building, Caleb John and his response team received the first emergency call within minutes. They couldn't move in. The smart locking system had been seized entirely. The hostage count ran into the dozens, and whoever was inside clearly understood security protocols better than a random gunman should. Caleb requested the guest and staff roster immediately. When Mason Carter's name appeared on the screen, he went still for a moment, though he said nothing to the officers gathered around him. Back inside, Hunter pulled Mason into the center of the floor, positioning Eleanor on one side and Mason on the other. He announced loud enough for the entire room to hear that Mason would open the central control room for him, or someone in this room would pay the price for his refusal. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward the quiet man in the gray jacket, and most of them saw exactly what Hunter wanted them to see: an ordinary man being pushed towards something far beyond him. A few of the older guests near the back exchanged glances, wondering aloud in whispers why anyone would trust a maintenance worker with the fate of the company's leadership. Nobody expected an answer. Nobody thought there was one to give. Eleanor studied Mason for a long moment, searching his face for panic and finding instead a strange, settled quiet that unsettled her more than fear would have. She filed the observation away without understanding it yet, the way a person notices a detail out of place without quite knowing why it matters. Hunter shoved Mason ahead of him down the service stairwell toward the technical control level, certain he was hurting nothing more than a man who understood breaker panels and employee codes. Mason kept his voice low, his posture unthreatening, asking questions that sounded harmless enough on the surface. Which door had Hunter used to get inside? What documents did he actually want? Who had told him the control room could unlock the data vault upstairs? The questions drew out details Hunter hadn't meant to share. He kept circling back to financial files and Eleanor's signature, when a man seeking justice for his own firing should have cared more about exposing the injustice itself than about a specific document buried in the company's servers. Mason understood then that revenge wasn't the true engine driving this night. Someone else had aimed Hunter at this building the way a person aims a tool. Eleanor watched from a distance as guards walked her along the corridor behind them, and she noticed something odd about the way Mason moved. He didn't stare at the floor the way a frightened man would. He tracked reflections in the glass panels lining the hallway, counted his own footsteps, matched his pace to the rhythm of the electronic locks clicking open and shut ahead of them. It didn't look like fear, it looked like calculation. Amelia, trailing a few steps back under guard, noticed it too, along with the way Mason positioned his body to block Hunter's line of sight toward a woman on the verge of collapse. When they reached the control panel, Hunter ordered Mason to open it immediately. Mason worked with deliberate slowness, claiming the system needed to restart before it would accept new commands. While the screen loaded, he triggered a secondary alert that didn't appear anywhere on the main display, a quiet signal sent out through a maintenance line Hunter had no reason to know existed. It wasn't a dramatic act. It was simply the work of a man who understood how to use the environment around him to buy time, without anyone noticing he'd done it. Hunter's patience thinned as the seconds dragged. He stepped close, his voice dropping into something meant to humiliate, telling Mason that men like him only knew how to bow their heads and take orders. Mason didn't answer the insult directly. Instead, he said evenly that if Hunter genuinely wanted to survive the night, he should start asking himself who had made it this easy for him to walk into the building in the first place. For the first time since he'd taken the stage, something in Hunter's certainty cracked. His eyes flickered, just slightly, toward the memory of how smoothly every door had opened for him, how conveniently the guest list had accepted his name, how little effort the whole plan had actually required. It was the first small fracture in a story he'd been telling himself for weeks. And Mason had seen exactly where to press. Mason didn't push further. He let the silence do the rest of the work, watching Hunter's jaw tighten as the question settled somewhere he couldn't easily dismiss it. Men in Hunter's position rarely questioned the person who had handed them a plan. They simply followed the plan because stopping to ask questions felt like admitting they'd already lost control of their own choices. Mason recognized that particular kind of desperation. He'd seen it before, in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and he knew the only way through it was patience, not force. Mason returned to the ballroom floor with Hunter close behind him, and outside the building Caleb John received the quiet secondary signal Mason had sent from the control room. He immediately ordered his team to hold position, telling the officers gathered around the command vehicle that someone inside appeared to be managing the pace of the situation with real skill. When one of them asked who he meant, Caleb only said that if his suspicion about Mason Carter was correct, they needed to give the man room to work. Inside, Mason began a quiet campaign that had nothing to do with confrontation. He didn't challenge Hunter directly or attempt anything that would draw attention to himself as a hero. He helped an older man slow his breathing. He gestured for a cluster of guests to move away from the glass wall near the terrace. He kept his voice low and even whenever panic threatened to spread, and each small act made it harder for Hunter to manufacture the chaos he needed to maintain control of the room. Lucas noticed the shift immediately and didn't like it. He leaned toward Hunter and murmured that Mason was stalling deliberately, that Eleanor was likely playing him for a fool. Hunter's temper flared, but a new suspicion crept in alongside it, a question about how Lucas seemed to know so much about what was happening inside a hostage situation he supposedly had no part in. Eleanor caught the exchange from several feet away and filed it carefully. Mason found a moment to approach Amelia with a sentence that sounded utterly ordinary, something about a maintenance report on the lower level. Amelia understood immediately, remembering an email she'd received weeks earlier about that same section of the building. Quietly, she recalled that several of Lucas's questionable transfers traced back to a secondary server housed in the old control room downstairs, the very space Hunter had just dragged Mason through. Piece by piece, the shape of the night became clear to Mason. Hunter was the immediate danger in the room, but Lucas was the one who had opened the doors, supplied the information, and driven Hunter into a corner desperate enough to act. If the police forced their way in too soon, Hunter could be killed before he ever spoke, and Lucas would emerge from the wreckage looking like the man who had saved the company. Near the end of this stretch, Hunter forced Eleanor to the small table where the transfer documents waited, insisting she sign before his patience ran out entirely. Eleanor lifted the pen, but her eyes found Mason across the room first. He gave the smallest shake of his head, barely a motion at all. She lowered the pen a fraction, deciding to stretch the moment as long as she could, placing her trust, for the first time that night, in the man she had dismissed with a nod hours earlier. Hunter noticed the delay and demanded she finish, his patience thinning with every passing second, but Eleanor kept her voice steady, asking clarifying questions about a clause near the bottom of the page, buying seconds the way a person bargains with a fire, slowly, carefully, never letting it see how much she feared it. Mason watched the exchange without moving, ready to step in the instant Hunter's temper crossed a line neither of them could afford. Eleanor pretended to study each clause of the document with careful attention, drawing Hunter's patience thinner by the minute. Lucas pressed her to sign quickly, insisting the safety of everyone in the room mattered more than legal formality. But Eleanor had begun to notice how badly Lucas wanted that signature, more urgently than any concern for the hostages seemed to justify. She asked Hunter calmly, who had convinced him that this particular signature would restore his reputation. Hunter struggled to answer with any real clarity. Hunter kept Mason standing beside Eleanor as a witness to the signing. In the brief seconds available to him, Mason murmured that she should not sign the final page, that it wasn't a settlement with Hunter at all but a transfer of access to a dormant financial account. Eleanor was startled that he had understood the structure of a legal document from little more than a glance across the table. In front of Hunter, Eleanor asked Mason what he had done before coming to work at Meridian. His answer was short. He said his old work no longer mattered. The brevity of it only deepened her curiosity. Outside, Caleb requested a full pull of Mason's personnel file. The public record was thin, a security technician with a clean history and years of steady, unremarkable employment. But when Caleb ran the name through an interagency system, large sections of the file came back sealed. One surviving note referenced a former assignment with a special operations unit trained in urban hostage rescue and the protection of high-value individuals. Caleb didn't share the full weight of that discovery with his team, only that the man inside had more experience than any of them had assumed. It left an open question hanging over the operation. Why had a man with that history chosen to disappear into a quiet, invisible job? What had happened that made him walk away from all of it? Inside the ballroom, Hunter noticed the look passing between Eleanor and Mason and lost his temper entirely. He forced Mason to his knees in front of the crowd, determined to humiliate him publicly. The room went silent. Mason didn't resist. He understood that if he pushed back and made Hunter feel his control slipping, the entire situation could detonate in an instant. He accepted the humiliation without a word, choosing the safety of everyone else in the room over his own dignity. That single moment changed something in how Eleanor saw him. She realized his strength had nothing to do with winning a public confrontation. It lived instead in his willingness to endure exactly what needed enduring, at exactly the right moment, so that everyone around him could still walk out alive. She thought of every time she had walked past him in the hallway without a second glance, every report he had filed that she had signed off without reading closely, every assumption she had made about who deserved her attention and who didn't. None of it sat comfortably with her now, whatever came next. She understood that the man kneeling in front of Hunter was not the man she had dismissed hours earlier, and she intended to remember that, whatever happened before the night was through. The gears of her thinking had shifted permanently now, away from titles and toward the people who actually kept the building, and the company, standing upright. Amelia uncovered a fragment of buried information in the building's secondary security archive. Years earlier, Mason had survived a hostage rescue that ended only partly successful, one where he had saved many lives but lost a close teammate in the process. After that night, he left his unit entirely, choosing an ordinary life where he could raise his daughter far away from violence of any kind. None of this reached the ballroom directly. It surfaced instead through Caleb's reaction outside, through Eleanor's growing suspicion, and through brief flashes of memory that crossed Mason's mind while he stood in the middle of the crisis he hadn't chosen. The memory came to him only briefly: a distant siren, a dark corridor, a decision made in half a second, and a promise he had made to himself never to leave an innocent person behind again. It surfaced and receded quickly, never allowed to slow him down. Hunter, unsteady now, began describing evidence he claimed proved that Eleanor herself had buried his original complaint years ago. Mason asked where that evidence had come from. Hunter said someone on the board wanted justice done properly. Mason's eyes moved immediately toward Lucas, standing near the far wall. Lucas sensed the danger and pivoted fast, shouting that Mason was the real threat in the room, that a former soldier hiding among them was more dangerous than Hunter had ever been. Hunter wavered, caught between needing Mason to open the systems he required and fearing the very capability Lucas had just described aloud. Mason chose to reveal part of the truth. He admitted he had once trained to handle crisis situations, but insisted that didn't make Hunter his enemy. He explained plainly that Hunter was being used as a living shield. If anyone in this room got hurt tonight, the person who benefited wouldn't be Hunter. It would be whoever had opened the door and let him walk through it. The words landed hard. Hunter's mind flashed back to the building schematics Lucas had sent him weeks earlier, the guest codes, the promise that exposing Meridian's wrongdoing would finally give him back his name. Lucas had never once stood beside him as an ally tonight. He stood instead among the victims, playing innocent, letting Hunter carry every ounce of the risk alone. Near the end of this stretch, Lucas quietly triggered a deletion command on the secondary server downstairs. Mason noticed the shift the instant the security lights changed rhythm. He understood immediately that time had run out. He needed to keep the hostages safe, keep Hunter alive long enough to tell the truth, and stop Lucas before every piece of evidence vanished for good. The clock had narrowed to something almost physical now, a pressure he could feel in his chest the same way he remembered feeling it years earlier in corridors far more hostile than this one. He pushed the memory aside before it could take root. Tonight wasn't about what he'd lost. It was about what he could still save, and that distinction, small as it seemed, was the only thing keeping his hands steady. Mason told Hunter he needed to reach the old control level to retrieve the real proof of everything Hunter believed about the company. Hunter hesitated, suspicious, but agreed, driven as much by his own need to know whether he'd been betrayed as by any remaining trust in Mason. Eleanor asked to go with them, insisting only she carried the legal authority to access certain systems. Lucas objected far too quickly, and the speed of his objection told everyone watching exactly how much he had to hide. The small group, Mason, Eleanor, Hunter, and a single guard forced along at gunpoint, made their way down toward the lower level. The atmosphere shifted from the gilded ballroom above into a cold, narrow hallway lined with humming machinery and dim emergency lighting. Hunter's nerves stretched tighter with every step. Eleanor fought to keep her composure. Mason stayed close enough to shield her without making Hunter feel cornered, a balance that required more control than anyone else in that hallway understood. Along the way, Mason kept guiding Hunter toward the holes in his own story. He asked why a powerful executive determined to hide the truth would have granted Hunter high-level access to the building in the first place. Hunter had no answer. Eleanor added that she had never seen Hunter's original complaint in its true form, only a version that had clearly been edited before it reached her desk. When they reached the secondary server room, the deletion process Lucas had triggered was already running. Mason didn't attempt anything elaborate with the machines themselves. Instead, he guided Eleanor to use her executive authority to freeze the legal system in an emergency lockdown. Amelia, still upstairs, confirmed the administrative code through an internal device, and the evidence began to surface. Lucas had embezzled company funds for months, blamed outside contractors for the losses, and finally staged this entire hostage crisis to force Eleanor into signing away control while he erased every trace of what he'd done. Hunter's composure broke completely once he understood he wasn't a man seeking justice at all, but a tool in someone else's scheme. The realization only deepened his desperation, and desperation still made him dangerous. He refused to surrender, certain nobody would ever listen to him after everything that had already happened tonight. Mason drew on his own past to reach him. He said that some people made terrible choices during one impossible night, but what separated them wasn't the mistake itself. It was whether they stopped before there was no way back. It was the most personal thing Mason had said all evening, revealing a man who understood guilt and the long road back from it far better than his calm exterior ever suggested. Near the end of this stretch, Lucas cut the internal communications and sealed the lower level remotely. Mason, Eleanor, and Hunter were trapped together while Lucas began preparing a story upstairs, one where Hunter had killed the CEO and destroyed the evidence before turning the weapon on himself. Mason tested the sealed door once calmly without wasted motion, then turned back to Eleanor and Hunter with the same steady expression he'd worn all night. He told them there was another way out, an older service route rarely used since the building's last renovation, one that would take longer but avoid whatever Lucas had planned for the main stairwell. Hunter, still reeling from everything he had just learned, followed without argument for the first time since the evening began. Mason understood that if Lucas controlled the story told upstairs, everyone trapped below would lose regardless of what happened next. He needed to turn Hunter from a threat into a living witness, the single reversal at the heart of the entire night, the man chosen to be a sacrifice becoming the only person who could save the very people who had once looked past him. Hunter still didn't fully trust him. He asked why Mason would bother saving a man who had threatened an entire room of innocent people only hours earlier. Mason answered plainly without any attempt to soften it. If Hunter died down here, Lucas won everything. If Hunter lived and told the truth, everyone upstairs still had a chance. The honesty of the answer, stripped of any performance, was what finally moved Hunter to listen. Eleanor grew in this stretch as well. Rather than waiting passively to be rescued, she used her knowledge of the building to help Mason chart a path back to the ballroom through the Freop service stairwell. She admitted quietly that she had trusted the company's systems far too easily and listened far too rarely to the people working on the floors below her own office. It marked a real shift in her, from a woman defined by control to one willing to take responsibility for what she had missed. Mason built a simple plan out of what little they had. Get Eleanor back into the ballroom to expose the evidence publicly, get Hunter to confess in front of the surviving cameras, and force Lucas into the open before he could finish rewriting the night's story. Mason kept the plan focused on timing, coordination, and misdirection rather than anything reckless, using the same discipline that had once carried him through far worse circumstances. Outside the building, Caleb received a brief signal from Amelia confirming that Lucas was likely the true architect behind everything happening inside. He made the call not to storm the building the way Lucas clearly hoped they would. Instead, the team outside applied pressure through legal and public means, demanding an open, recorded line of negotiation instead of a raid inside the ballroom. Lucas grew increasingly unsettled as his attempts to reach Hunter went unanswered. He told the remaining guests that Eleanor had been taken away by Hunter and hinted that Mason was likely his accomplice. But those who had already watched Mason shield a stranger earlier that night found it harder and harder to believe a single word Lucas said. As this stretch ended, Mason, Eleanor, and Hunter approached the ballroom through a side corridor, and Mason caught sight of Lucas holding a half-signed document, preparing to name himself emergency successor before the night was through. Mason knew this was the moment the truth needed to come out in front of everyone at once. He glanced once at Eleanor, and something passed between them that didn't need words, an understanding built in the space of a few desperate hours that neither of them could have predicted at the start of the evening. Hunter, standing just behind them, straightened his shoulders for the first time all night, less like a man cornered and more like a man finally choosing, on his own terms, to walk towards something instead of running from it. Mason stepped into the ballroom first, deliberately letting Lucas believe Hunter had already broken him. Lucas seized the moment, loudly accusing Mason of collaboration, claiming a maintenance worker with a violent past had exploited the chaos to manipulate the CEO. It was a direct strike at Mason's reputation, but this time he didn't let it pass in silence the way he had all evening. Eleanor emerged just behind him, alive, composed, holding the frozen financial evidence in her hand. The entire room went still. Hunter followed last, no longer carrying the commanding presence he'd walked in with hours earlier, but the shaken look of a man who finally understood how badly he'd been used. He confirmed, in front of everyone, that Lucas had supplied the access codes, the building schematics, and false information that had driven him to this point. Lucas tried to run, or perhaps to trigger one final deletion, but Caleb's team outside had already locked down the system remotely. Amelia displayed the access logs publicly, proving beyond doubt that Lucas had opened the doors for Hunter himself. Investors, board members, and reporters alike watched the truth unfold in real time. Hunter's control snapped one final time. Betrayed and furious, he lunged toward Lucas, ready to end things with his own hands. Mason stopped him with a single short sentence, warning that if Hunter did this, Lucas would still win, because it would turn Hunter into exactly the monster the plan had always needed him to be. Hunter froze, trembling, and slowly lowered his arm. It was Mason's most important victory of the night, quieter than anything physical, but far more decisive around them. The police finally breached the outer perimeter now that Caleb had confirmation the true threat had been contained from within. Officers moved through the ballroom with practiced efficiency, but the tension in the room had already broken, replaced by the exhausted stillness of people who had survived something they still didn't fully understand. Lucas was taken into custody. Hunter was restrained but alive, left able to give a full account of everything that had happened. There was no excess of violence, no dramatic final struggle. The focus stayed on truth, restraint, and the quiet reversal at the center of it all, a man chosen to be humiliated instead becoming the reason the entire scheme collapsed under its own weight. Eleanor stood in the middle of the wreckage of what should have been a celebration and felt, for the first time in years, that the ground beneath Meridian Global might actually be solid again, not because of a merger or a quarterly report, but because one man had refused to let fear decide how the night ended. Around them, guests who had spent the evening screening every stranger for danger now looked at Mason with something closer to disbelief, unsure how to reconcile the quiet technician they'd ignored with the man who had just unraveled a conspiracy in front of them. In the days that followed, Meridian Global opened itself to a sweeping investigation. Lucas faced charges for embezzlement, manipulation of a crisis, and endangering dozens of lives inside a building he was supposed to protect. Hunter faced legal consequences of his own, but his testimony helped unravel the entire scheme from the inside. Eleanor publicly apologized to employees the company had overlooked for years, especially the contractors Lucas had quietly blamed for his own failures. Mason refused every request to become the face of what had happened. He wanted no headlines, no return to the world of danger and recognition he had walked away from long ago. Eleanor offered him a leadership role overseeing crisis and safety operations across the company, not out of pity but because she had finally seen the qualities Meridian actually needed all along: composure, integrity, and the ability to notice the people everyone else overlooked. Mason considered the offer carefully. He told her what he needed wasn't power, but a workplace that no longer treated its quietest people as invisible. Eleanor agreed to rebuild the culture from the inside out, one decision at a time. It became less a rescue story and more a story about repairing an organization that ambition had nearly hollowed out from within. Amelia was promoted into a role overseeing internal compliance, the very department that had failed to catch Lucas for so long. Caleb, for his part, never spoke publicly about what he'd learned regarding Mason's past, honoring an unspoken agreement between two men who understood that some histories were owed privacy rather than headlines. His daughter appeared only once more, indirectly, through a brief phone call near the end of the night. He heard the familiar voice of the woman who watched her, assuring him everything at home was fine. Mason looked out over the rain-washed city, exhausted but lighter than he had felt in years. The quiet reminder of why he had chosen an ordinary life waiting for him at home. In the final moments, Eleanor watched Mason leave through the main entrance instead of the service door he had used on his way in. Everyone who had once looked past him now stood still, watching him go. They didn't know the full weight of his history, only that on the one night it mattered most. Hunter Xavier had chosen the wrong man to underestimate, and that man had turned out to be Mason Carter. He stepped out into the cool night air, the rain finally softening to a drizzle over the city, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself walk without checking the exits behind him. Somewhere above, the lights of Meridian Global still burned through the tall windows, but they no longer felt like a place he needed to watch. Tomorrow he would go home to an ordinary morning, quiet and unremarkable, built on top of an extraordinary night that almost no one would ever fully understand. If breathless reversals and quiet men hiding impossible pasts pull you in, stay until the end for Mason's answer.